Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Room to Grow podcast. Today, I'm delighted to have Nick Hillman, who is the chief of the Higher Education Policy Institute, better known as HEPI. Nick, before we sort of kick off, tell us a little bit about what HEPI does, and actually, probably just as interesting, what you were doing before you became HEPI chief.
Oh, well, thanks very much. I head up the Higher Education Policy Institute. It's an Oxford-based think tank. It's been going for 23 years. We do all the things that think tanks do. So we churn out lots of reports. We did 40 reports last year, all on higher education, but every aspect of higher education, from research and teaching and learning, the student experience, widening participation, so on and so forth. We do lots and lots of events as well, because we try to, I guess, we sit between policymakers in the university world and the higher education world more generally, and we try to get the two sides to understand each other. And before that, the reason I've ended up doing this fascinating role is that before that, I was a political advisor to the Minister for Universities and Science back in the days of the coalition. This is going back a long time now, over a decade. But I worked for David Willetts in what was then the business department, working on higher education at the time of the spending review of 2010, when tuition fees were being increased, when the student number caps were being removed. So it was a very exciting time.
I bet, and he was called David Two Brains Willetts, as I recall. So he must have been a really interesting guy to work for. Although I'm sure he's not a fan of that particular
Well,
moniker.
it was great. One could bask in sort of reflected glory, because he is indeed a phenomenally intelligent man. And people's intelligence, of course, shows itself in different ways. And his intelligence showed itself by being really keen to absorb new information. He liked it, unlike most politicians. He liked it when people came along and challenged him and said, I think you're wrong because I've got some other evidence you might not have seen yet here.
Sure.
And he was also always very grateful for all the work his team did for him. So yeah, I worked for him for a long time, and he remains a hero of mine, really.
Yeah, and I follow what he does. Is it at Joseph Rowntree and elsewhere? To this day, he is an interesting speaker. Before we move on to the questions, I should just give you some congratulations. I think you've got another trip to the palace coming up, have you not?
Well, it's very kind of you to say so. I was very honoured at the weekend to be given an OBE, so for services to higher education. So I had
Fantastic,
no idea
fantastic.
it was in the offing, but I've worked in this sector for a long, long time, and it's just wonderful to feel that the work I've done trying to promote debates around higher education has been recognised in that way. So all I can say is some champagne was drunk over the weekend.
Very good. Well, congratulations from me, and I know our listeners will feel the same way. So,
And
so
I'm
coming
very,
to the
I mean,
chase,
you don't get those awards, I understand, without a number of people sort of
of course,
proposing you and
of
putting your
course.
name forward. So I'm very grateful to anybody who did that. I don't know who they are, so I don't know who to thank, but I am very grateful.
Yes, can't hold up my hand for that one. So, A-level results are out in a couple of months, I think, pretty much this week. What are you expecting to see this year in terms of domestic student numbers coming into UKHE in September?
Yes, so you're absolutely right. In the middle of August or so, there'll be A-level results day. In fact, they call it results day now because, of course, quite a lot of people going up to higher education don't have A-levels. They have BTECs, or they have a mix of BTECs and A-levels, or they have T-levels, or they have the International Baccalaureate, whole range of qualifications. And I'm generally an optimist, particularly about our sector, because I think it really does transform people's lives. But I'm not quite as jolly as I thought I was going to be in 2025. So 5 years ago, for example, we were all looking forward to a decade where year after year after year, there would just be more 18-year-olds. And we assumed that more and more of them would want to go to higher education. And so by the middle of this decade, 2025, we were expecting to be in the middle of a boom. And we're not really in the middle of a boom. The numbers are more or less flat. So they're not declining. And there may even be a very small increase once, everything's been processed, once those A-level results are out. But it's basically flatlining year to year.
Yeah.
And that's depressing, because if you have the same number of 18-year-olds go this year than went last year, that's actually a slightly smaller proportion of the cohort, because, as I've already said, there are more 18-year-olds this year than there were last year because of what happened to the birth rate 18 years ago. There is one extra complexity here, of course, which is COVID, because during COVID, there was a big bump up in how many people went to higher education.
Indeed.
Everybody said people would be put off from higher education because COVID just ripped up the rule book. Actually, the opposite turned out to be true. People worked out in COVID, they didn't want to stay at home with their parents. And it was even more important than ever that they got as many skills and qualifications as they could to be successful in the labour market. The labour market was tough in COVID. So there was a big bounce during COVID, and that's sort of we've moved off that. And people don't quite know if we're on a new normal that is flatlining from year to year, or if from about next year we'll get back on the upward trajectory as that sort of COVID bump works its way out of the system.
Yeah, and of course, 18-year-olds will begin to flatline and decline from 2030, I think is the year. So participation then becomes, or participation rates then becomes absolutely key. And I know one of your passions is, white working class boys. And so I guess it is, and their life outcomes. And I guess it is, concerning to see that participation is beginning to stall.
Yeah, so you're right. So if we're talking about domestic students, they top out in terms of number of school leavers in 2030. It used to scare me rigid because my daughter will be applying to university that year, and I used to think
Peak year.
Yeah, and it could still be like that, of course. It will still be peak year in terms of the number of 18-year-olds, but we don't know, obviously, what's going to happen to demand between now and then. And there's, of course, a whole separate policy debate going on about whether policymakers should reimpose student number caps, which would be another obstacle in the way of people going to higher education. Now, what happens after 2030, which is really your question, is incredibly unknown, I suppose. I mean, we have written reports in the past that suggested that after 2030, you could still have some higher education growth, even among home students, even when the number of 18-year-olds is falling slightly. And the logic for that is if people go on doing better at school. So, for example, London schools have been transformed in the past 10, 15 years, and Londoners are much more likely to go to higher education than people elsewhere. If you could have a similar continued transformation outside London, then you could have more people with the qualifications ready to enroll in higher education, even if there's a slightly smaller number of 18 year old. And that's happened in the past. That has happened in the past. But of course, other people would say, well, you can't have growth forevermore. There has to come a point where the numbers level off. But then, then you look at the OECD data and you say, well, Britain's pretty good at sending young people to higher education, but there are countries that still send a lot more people.
Yeah, South Korea and the like. Yeah.
And so maybe there is still room for growth. And then you look at the issue you just raised of boys, for example. Boys are much less likely to go to university than girls, particularly disadvantaged boys. And as you say, there's an ethnicity angle as well. Why working class boys are very, very unlikely to go to higher education in the main. So that is a bad thing, but equally it means there's plenty of grounds for further growth if we can entice boys into staying in formal education for longer. There is another complexity as well, of course, which is a lot of the rhetoric coming out of government, both governments, the previous government and the current government, is about lifelong learning. And they sometimes sound a little bit as if it's not that important that you go at 18 and you can get a lifelong learning entitlement and go back later in life. And so there's all sorts of things swirling around. I remain an optimist. University transformed my life in the sense that I wouldn't be doing this job. I wouldn't have got the OBE you referred to if I hadn't gone to 3 universities, actually. And I think it transforms other people's lives in economic ways and social ways and all sorts of beneficial ways. And I think deep down inside, a lot of people know that, and a lot of people want their children to go to university. So I do remain an optimist that higher education will continue to be a force for good in the world.
Glad to hear it. Our listeners will be keen to hear your thoughts on the international student outlook. I mean, Sterling is performing very well at the moment, which of course makes UK HE more expensive. We've got changes to the graduate route, more hurdles for dependents of students and so forth. Weighed against that, of course, we've got what's going on in the US with President Trump and the sort of things going on at Harvard and so forth. What are you hearing? And I guess it's too early for data, but what are you hearing from your conversations with VCs and others about the international student outlook for the upcoming period?
Well, I'm glad you raised the exchange rate point because I don't think we talk about that often enough in our sector. And we saw, didn't we, for example, a big collapse in Nigerian students coming to
Did.
the UK when their economy had trouble and their local currency it lost its value and made it very hard for Nigerian students to come here and for the ones that were already here to pay their way. And it was tragic, really. And so exchange rates do matter, and we saw that post the Brexit referendum as well, when the pound lost some of its value, and actually the UK managed to maintain and grow its share of non-EU international students. So exchange rates matter. Geopolitics matters. You mentioned the Trump effect. Competition matters. And one of the things that's happened in recent years, Australia and Canada have become just a little bit less open to international
They have.
students. And so if
Yeah.
the US looks a less sort of nice environment to go and study in, and Australia and Canada don't look quite as positive either, then there's a real opportunity there for the UK. But equally, as you say, the previous government toughened up the rules, stopped people on taught master's courses bringing independence. So a big drop as a result in the numbers, for example, from India and countries close to India, the Indian subcontinent. Um, and that a big drop off. The Chinese numbers have remained pretty healthy. So there have been lots of different things going on, and because particularly of that dependence rule, the number of new international students coming to the UK did fall last calendar year, 2024, by a significant amount. What you said at the end of your question, what am I hearing on the ground? And I do spend my life in universities. I pretty much every day I'm on the train. Tomorrow I'm on the train
Yeah.
to Liverpool, I'm in Oxford today, Liverpool tomorrow. Um, Visiting universities, and they're a bit more positive than they were this time last year, partly because of the things I've already said, partly that they hope what the current UK system will be a little bit more stable and a few less negative press stories about will there be yet more crackdowns. On the other hand, the new government, the Labour government, has been in power for a year now, did recently do a migration white paper that did talk about slightly reducing the post-study work rights from 2 years to 18 months, toughening up some of the requirements on universities under the basic compliance tests. And indeed, they even threatened to impose a levy on international student fees in the
They
future.
did.
Lots of people
Yeah.
don't think that will ever happen, but if it did happen, then so I think in the short term, we can benefit from some of the problems happening around the world. And by the way, I say that with no pleasure at all, because while I do want lots of international students in the UK, they keep our universities going. They make our universities more vibrant. They make the lecture halls more interesting places to be, and of course they help financially as well, of course. It's not good for the cause of education around the world that the American system is pulling down the shutters. Think of those research projects that would include academics at Harvard and academics at Oxford, or think about those international students who might do a master's here and a PhD there, or the other way around, or do a postdoc in one country and their PhD before that in another. Research in higher education works best when borders are porous, when they're lower. I mean, of course, national governments have a right to control migration and all the other things that they must absolutely do. But nonetheless, research is best when it's transnational, when early career researchers can get experience in different labs in different countries. So it gives me no pleasure that we might benefit in the short term from some of the things Donald Trump is doing to Harvard.
Good to hear there's no Schadenfreude in the Hellman household. Yeah, I agree with that completely. We should just talk a little bit about, and I'm glad you're positive, by the way, but we should just talk a little bit about, the OFS saying, I think that 75% of universities are running a deficit. We were all ears to the comprehensive spending review last week, and it was pretty quiet on HE. There was some sort of good news for research, but I think those numbers have largely been spoken about already. But with universities like Dundee essentially, insolvent and in special measures, I think many of our listeners will worry about that counterparty risk in some of the cities in which they have housing. I mean, what's your sense of just how precarious some of these institutions are?
Well, I've worked in higher education policy since since 2007, rather. So nearly 20 years. And it does feel a more precarious, more dicey situation than at any point in that period. Um, and Dundee is a very good example of that. Dundee has basically hit the wall, but is getting some financial support from the Scottish Funding Council and the Scottish government. And the Dundee situation is really interesting because it leads some people to think, well, if they bail out Dundee, they'll bail out anybody.
Exactly.
We don't need to worry
Exactly.
too much. When you go to Scotland, other Scottish universities take a slightly different view. They take the view that if there's any money on the table to help universities, it is finite. And the more of it that Dundee gets, the less of it will be available for other institutions. So there's more than one way to look at this issue. I have always believed, despite what politicians say, that if any major UK university topples, wobbles, actually falls over, then there is a public interest in stepping in here. Margaret Thatcher did it, Cardiff University College in the 1980s. And when you think of these universities, they're often the biggest employer in a local area, at least the second biggest behind the National Health Service sometimes. They have thousands of students, tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of alumni. They've been built up with public money. They have been built up with public money over the years. So to just let them go to the wall and put the padlocks on, and it would be a bizarre thing to do. So I do think a government would need to step in. I do believe the OFS numbers that a majority are likely to be running a deficit in 2025, 2026. Short-term deficits are not necessarily catastrophic. More than half of universities, of course, are running voluntary redundancy schemes. But you don't want to get into a spiral where you've got year after year of deficits, or you're doing voluntary redundancies and you're losing some of your best staff who could be, the answer to your problems. I do think ministers in government need to grip this. I mean, UK universities are autonomous. They set their own strategies. They set their own path. But it is politicians who've decided to hold down the tuition fee level for British students. Well, let's talk about English students going to English universities for a minute. They've held down. The fee came in at £9,000 a year in 2012. It's £9,250 a year now. And there was a period during that where inflation was over 10%. So in real terms, universities are getting only about less than £6,000 a year to educate
Right.
their young
Yeah.
people. And that's now, so that is deeply problematic and regrettable, because all the things the policymakers want to do, like economic growth, improve productivity, what the previous government used to call levelling up, regional policy, the quickest way to succeed on all those things is by working with universities, because that's where the expertise is. So, and also, nobody doubts that one of the things the UK still does it to a world-class level is higher education. So we don't want to, we don't want to
Well,
put
yeah. So, and
give
haven't
that
they
up.
just launched a? Yeah, they just launched a soft power sort of commission or something, haven't they? Which has called out UKHE, the universities, the British Council, my old employer, and the World Services as three very important soft power sort of. While this vacuum is being created globally by Trump's exit from many regions and his sort of anti-internationalist, for want of a better
Yeah.
term, view, allowing this vacuum for China and Russia to step in. There's a real case now for Britain to actually push its world class, HE.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, we've had the officials from the Foreign Office on the phone to us saying, "Can we talk to you?" Because we do something called a soft power index every year, where we look at how many very senior world leaders. We only look at monarchs, presidents, and prime ministers were educated outside their own home country, and where did they go? And what we found last year when we did it, we haven't done the numbers yet for this year, but we will soon. What we found was 70 current world leaders were educated in the US, the United States, and 58 were educated in the UK, and every other country was miles behind. And there are 195 countries in the world that we count for this survey. So the fact there's 58 current serving world leaders at a very high level who've been educated in the UK is immense soft power.
It's pretty
And
impressive, and I remember you telling me it's one of Heppy's most read reports annually. But those numbers are slightly dwindling, aren't they? But anyway, we could talk about world leaders all day long. LSE used to be proud to boast when I worked there that it educated 27 heads of state or some such an amazing number. I will just come back to your point, and I'm good to hear you're optimistic that you feel the government would step in. I sort of take a slightly more nuanced view than that myself, which I'd just like to tease out with you, which is, a university like, and I'm not, picking on them other than by dint of geography, a university like Cumbria, say, that's based in Carlisle and Ambleside and these campuses round and about, it's almost inconceivable, I think, that the government would allow that to fail. But I do wonder if some institutions in larger metropolitan areas that are well served by a number of HE providers, I'm thinking London, Manchester, Birmingham, those kind of areas, whether we would see government step in, or whether they would just say, well, that's it, it's the market,
Well,
there'll be M&A activity and faculties will get merged into neighbouring institutions and so forth.
yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. You've drilled right down to the level of specific towns and cities and institutions, and let's talk about that. I try to avoid naming individual institutions, but let's talk about that. I mean, Cumbria, by the way, is currently running a surplus, and you're right. You couldn't let Cumbria fall over. I mean, for example, the apprentices building nuclear submarines in Barrow-in-Furness are doing so through the University of Cumbria. And as you say, you listed off some of the cities where the University of Cumbria has a presence, and I visited all of them, by the way. And it's a really interesting institution. Now, I'm a governor of the University of Manchester, so I know Greater Manchester's higher education provision incredibly well. Both the University of Manchester and Manchester Metropolitan University are currently thriving. I know Salford less well, but I think they're probably thriving too. There have been challenges, well publicised challenges at Bolton University in Greater Manchester, and the VC. They've currently got an interim vice chancellor there. Now, perhaps the University of Bolton is not as core to Manchester City as the University of Manchester, but it's really, really important to the people of Bolton, and it's doing a different job to the University of Manchester. It's much more teaching focused. It's much less research intensive. It's training people for local public services, which obviously places like Manchester University are doing as well, but it's not as big a proportion of their business. So I think what policymakers would say, because you're right, it's very easy to say, of course, policymakers will stand in, and the policymakers don't want to stand in because it costs money to stand in, and it creates a moral hazard problem. And so policymakers, what they really want is universities in trouble to merge with universities that are strong. And on paper, that sounds quite a sensible idea. But if you're a governor of a strong university, you have a legal duty as a charity trustee to make sure your charitable resources are being used for the education and research and other purposes that your university exists for. They don't exist to bail out the next door university that's in financial trouble. Now, I'm not opposed to mergers. I mean, City St George's in London, two strong institutions coming together, very successful. The University of Manchester, I've already mentioned, that is a merger of the old UMIST and the old Victoria University of Manchester. Very, very successful. I was at a university called Queen Mary in Westfield College, which now, of course, is Queen Mary.
Yeah, absolutely.
And lots of them are mergers. Mergers can work, but mergers don't work if it's the last minute decision to tackle an institution that's very close to toppling over. Because both institutions that are being merged into one another need to bring something to the table and to the party. And if one of them is going to fail unless it's merged tomorrow, then that's not actually a very attractive prospect for the one it's meant to be being merged with, whose league table position, for example, would probably plummet, who would have years of reorganization to do. So, I mean, there's a role for, you've mentioned the Office for Students, there's a role for the Office for Students here, there's a role for policymakers here, there's a role actually for local government here as well. We now have devolved authorities in large parts of the UK. We've got mayors in large parts of the UK. We've got unitary authorities. So it's not just a problem for policymakers at Westminster.
Sure. Okay. Final question, I think, or final area for us to sort of just tease out a bit, and that's the traditional residential learning model, which I know Heppy over the years has done a couple of blue books on this, and it emerged from Oxford and Cambridge and the boarding school tradition and so forth. These days, 55% of students work, I believe. And we're seeing a rise of commuter students, or students who, because of their contact hours being maybe 6-8 hours a week at undergraduate level, will actually just commute long distances to be at university for a night or two and then go back to wherever their main home is. Indeed, University of Sheffield have actually got a student hotel where you can book in for a couple of nights. Do you think that the sort of residential learning model that is so core to the United Kingdom is fundamentally on the wane? And if so, does it matter?
Well, I'm willing to be shot down in flames for saying this, and do get in touch if you disagree with me. But I actually think it is very resilient and it will survive. And the reason I believe that is that it offers something really powerful and important, which is my old boss, actually, David Willits, used to use the phrase that it's a route to adulthood in a secure environment. So it's a sort of safe route to adulthood. You go away from home at 18, but you're in a community. You're not just living in a bedsit on your own somewhere. You're in a community. And it's a sort of safer route to adulthood. You move to a different town or city. You're financially independent. You're living on your own, but also as part of a hall of residence or a PBSA block or a college or whatever it might be. And that is very beneficial. You meet your friends for life in those sorts of environments. Certainly when my children are 18, I'll be encouraging them to do that. And when I go and speak in schools, I talk through all these issues to them. I mean, I do think sometimes people don't make optimum student accommodation choices. If they're quite shy and it's really important they make sure they're living somewhere with good social spaces where it's really easy to meet other people. And not just living in a very nice room that they don't ever leave. So I think we do need better advice for young people about the choices they make. But of course, you mentioned those numbers about how many full-time students are doing paid jobs during term time, and I'm afraid it's even higher than you say. We published data last week now showing it's 68%. So it's more than 2/3 of students doing paid employment. And some of them are doing dangerous hours of work. What I mean by that is it's affecting their academic studies.
To their degree, yeah.
And that's bad. That's negative. And again, that government have a role here to improve maintenance support. But actually, what those working hours numbers show is how resilient young people are. The biggest lie told about young people is that they're snowflakes. If they were snowflakes, they'd be dropping out. They're not dropping out. We have the lowest dropout rates of any developed country in the world. They're not dropping out. Yeah. What they're doing is they're finding, I can't pay my rent. I need to up my hours. I need to get a job. I need to work. And that is detrimental in some respects to the student experience because there's less time to join the rugby club, less time to edit the student newspaper. A few hours a week of work during term time is fine, but some people are doing 20 hours a week of paid work during term time, on top of their full-time course. And that is when, yes, they're getting some CV brownie points for that, but their academic work is suffering, and they're not getting what we used to think of as the boarding school experience of all the other stuff the universities offer. So I'm very worried about this, but it's wrong to assume, I think, that students will just therefore automatically decide to live at home and pop along to their local university. Some will. The number of commuter students has gone up, but as a proportion of the total, it's not. It's not materially gone up. So some will. And of course, some people, it's the right thing for them to live at home. They've got caring responsibilities, for example, or they just love the area where they live, or the local university actually has the best course for them. Great. Sure. But it's a tragedy if they're feeling forced to live at home and unable to have the wider student experience simply because the maintenance loan hasn't kept up with the rising cost of living.
Yes, the point I was going to make, the erosion of that in real terms is obviously, part of the issue. Nick, we've run out of time. Fascinating to talk to you as always. Hopefully, we'll get you back in a future podcast, and we can opine on some of the other issues we've not had time to cover today. So
we should get back together thank you. We should get back together in 6 months and see if the predictions we talked about turned out true or true.
Indeed. Thanks very much, and cheerio.